Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, a historically humanist congregation. This is Coffee and Wisdom. This is Coffee and Wisdom summertime style, in which we're meeting live on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 9 a.m. Central Time. Well, past couple of weeks, I've been looking at transcendentalism. Today, I want to look at it as a fresh metaphor for reality, because that's really what it became as it got into the mainstream of more liberal religious styles. My handy dandy thumbnail here: transcendentalism is the spiritual unity of all forms of being, with God, people, and nature all sharing a universal soul. And I talked last week about this concept of the oversoul that does come out of Vedic humanism, Hinduism. So human knowledge transcends sensory experience. That's the central idea, and that's where the term transcendental comes from. We know things that we don't learn from books and from our senses. And this was a radical idea at the time, because Western philosophers had considered people to be born as tabula rasa. The writers of our Constitution, for example, very much thought John Locke was correct in that. This is a brand new idea, and it is a European idea coming out of German Romanticism that then spread into the rest of Europe and then into the United States. Well, I did mention last time that there is a book that you probably will enjoy if you like reading about American history and American ideas. That is American Bloomsbury, Louisa May Alcott, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Henry David Thoreau, their lives, their loves, and their work. Yeah, it was a little bit of a Peyton Place in some ways there in Cambridge, this book by Susan Cheever. And it is very interesting looking at these folks as human beings, but also at how their ideas did develop over time. I have mentioned that transcendentalism didn't stop. It didn't go out of style in 1850 or whatever. As a matter of fact, in the summer of 2015, the Unitarian Universalist World magazine would report that Jerome Stone's minimalist vision of transcendence without God, a liberal theologian, focuses on transcendent resources of grace and judgment. Yeah, that's still treated in some ways as news, but it hasn't actually been news since the 1830s in the Unitarian movement. As a matter of fact, the whole idea of this form of transcendentalism is very much outside of and beyond Unitarian Universalism at this point. Just as humanism develops within Unitarian Universalist thinking and then expands beyond it, just so the idea of transcendental immanence comes in many forms nowadays. It's very much a scholarly field in religious philosophy. There's a book called Nature's Transcendence and Immanence, a comparative interdisciplinary ecstatic naturalism. There you go. And then one called Deep Pantheism by Robert S. Corrington. Not a Unitarian Universalist, but certainly someone working within the idea of transcendentalism. And you can pick those up on the online bookstores near you. And there are lots and lots of these books out there that no longer refer back to historical transcendentalism or to the Unitarian and Universalist traditions that they did develop out of. So a little bit broader. Now, to go back again, just to kind of underline some ideas, really the first shot over the bow by transcendentalism was in 1836. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote an essay called The American Scholar in 1837. He took this on the road. He was a very famous orator in his day, and he really spread the ideas on a tour of the Eastern Seaboard, and he was very popular. But he has this to say in that particular essay: "The theory of books is noble. The scholar of the first age received it into him the world around, brooded thereon, gave it the new arrangement of his own mind, and uttered it again. It came into him life, it went out from him truth. It came to him short-lived actions. It went out from him immortal thoughts. It came to him business. It went out from him poetry. Now you're seeing the idea here that in the old days, and this is always one of the things that Emerson continues to hit, in the old days, people were experiencing reality for themselves and then turning it into scripture and philosophy and poetry. But nowadays, we don't do that. He goes on to say in that essay, man thinking must not be subdued by his instruments. Books are for the scholar's idle times. When he can read God directly, the hour is too precious to be wasted in other men's transcripts of their readings. But when the intervals of darkness come, as come they must, when the sun is hid and the stars withdraw their shining, we repair to the lamps which were kindled by their ray to guide our steps to the east again, where the dawn is. In other words, sure, do read a book. He's not going to go quite as far as William Wordsworth in dismissing the idea of that do come to us from books, but only read those when your own ecstatic visions out in nature are not with you. So that's the good use of books. But again, the whole idea here is personal experience. Well, the Transcendental Club, which gives the term transcendental to us, originally was called Hedge's Club, and it first met in 1836. That's why the American Scholar is a very early articulation of this, and you can watch Emerson's ideas changing a little bit over time. That's why I look early at this particular point. There were four guys involved in the first Transcendental Club: Frederick Henry Hedge, Ralph Waldo Emerson, George Ripley, and George Putnam. All were Harvard alums. As a matter of fact, they left a party at Harvard to go across the street to form this club, and they were Unitarians and Unitarian ministers when they started anyway, and then some stopped being and some did not. But that's the original group, and it was called together by Frederick Henry Hedge. Now, Hedge is a very interesting part of this story, 1805 to 1890. His books are still around today, Hours with German Classics. He was the preeminent German scholar, literary scholar in his day, formed the German Lit department at Harvard, but he also wrote a great deal about matters spiritual, such as Ways of the Spirit and other essays. His work is mostly, you can find it on PDFs online nowadays, but it is still out there in the world. Very unique character. At the age of 12, Hedge traveled to Germany. His parents sent him overseas to study music. He was a prodigy. He then entered Harvard on an advanced degree when he got back, and his knowledge of German that he picked up as a kid was to serve him well. For example, the most famous English translation of Martin Luther's great "A Mighty Fortress is Our God" was translated by a Reverend Hedge. Also, he was one of the few Americans able to read German romantics in their original language. He became the foremost German literature scholar in the US. Now, this probably should give us pause when we stop to think about the fact that he was able to read Hegel and Kant, the German romantics, in their original, and he didn't buy into these more radical ideas that people who couldn't read them in German were taking on. So this is one of the interesting facts about the matter. He had this to say: birth into this life was the death of the embryo life that preceded, and the death of this will be birth into some new mode of being. So we are continually in process. As a matter of fact, some scholars argue that he was the first process theologian that's later going to be taken up by Whitehead, and is still very much a movement within Unitarian Universalist circles today. But he began to rethink things a little bit. For example, he famously said, "No infallible oracle out of the breast." In other words, we are not going to be infallible in what we say from our heart. We also need to put some reason into it, a little bit of thought. And that's where he began to separate himself from the more radical transcendentalists. Hedge served then as president of the American Unitarian Association for 4 years, very much an institutionalist later in his life. But Hedge would not let go of reason as essential to religious thinking. That's what separates him out. As a matter of fact, famously, he wrote a book called Reason in Religion. And yes, in that book, he says that's a good thing. Okay. And so then he begins to reject the transcendentalist designation. As a matter of fact, he refuses to be published in the Dial, that is the main organ of transcendentalist thought. That is being published by Margaret Fuller that I discussed last week. So Reason and Religion, Frederick Henry Hedge, and you too can read that still today. He went on to teach theology at Harvard in the Divinity School to preparing Unitarian ministers. He had this to say: no form of Christianity is absolutely and only true. Each successive one was right in its place and good in its season. Each put forward the face and embodied the truth which the time required. A couple of interesting things there. One, yes, the ideas of theology will continue to move over time, and they do meet up with the social thinking of the day. So he's not a fundamentalist in any way, shape, or form, but do notice that it is no form of Christianity, and he's going to stick with Christianity within this tradition. That becomes very important in how this is all going to work out. And in that, you will hear an echo, if you were listening last week, of William Ellery Channing, the first Unitarian minister in the US, who rejected the more radical ideas of deism in his day. So we're going to get this tradition of ministers who are kind of trying to walk down a middle path as they go along. For example, he did publish a book called Christian Liturgy for the Use of the Church. Now, yes, think a moment that this is a guy who forms the Transcendentalist Club, but look at the table of contents from his book. Salutation, Te Deum Laudamus. Okay, wait a minute. We're even going to the Latin way of doing the liturgy. Morning prayer, evening prayer, scriptural inductions, the stated collects, special collects, communion service, the rite of baptism, the rite of confirmation, marriage service, burial service. And yes, this is very much a traditional Protestant Christian way of doing the liturgy. And this becomes very important because he's an influential minister within the Unitarian tradition. And so this is where the Christian tradition is going to stay within the Unitarian tradition through the later 19th century. That's where we are at the moment. I do want to talk about some lesser known characters next week, but also Thoreau and his castles in the air. Henry David Thoreau is probably the greatest dyed-in-the-wool believer of transcendentalism. Emerson does back away a little bit later in his life. Thoreau didn't live long enough, we could argue, to back away from his more radical transcendentalism. But we do want to look at how it is that he saw the existence in the world. And we really, within theology, would argue that he's an early phenomenologist that's later going to come up within European thinking. So more about Thoreau on Tuesday and Thursday of next week. And on Sunday, join me at 10:30 a.m. I will be talking about art and the mystery, and that is dealing with the idea of how we use metaphor to understand deeper realities. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you on Sunday.